Hi, this is Paul. I've been watching a lot of reviews on the Zizek Peterson debate / conversation, and I wanted to integrate a bunch of them into the question of liberals and progressives. This is a review done by a journalist who's written for a number of major periodicals, newspapers, and he lives in Bali, and he has a very small YouTube channel, but I found his analysis of the Peterson-Zizek debate fascinating, so I want to play some of it.
So we were having to pretend.
Okay, so his name is Damon Walter, and he's when I saw it at about this video had about 500 views, so it's gotten some good traction, and I think the YouTube algorithm is promoting the conversation around this debate. So let's hear some of what he has to say.
Potentially very opposed ideological positions, and two very in the room. So we were having two potentially very opposed ideological positions, and two of their key champions, their fighters, coming together. And what happened is that they didn't fight. And this is the question that really interests me. Why is it that Zizek and Peterson didn't fight? Now, I'll give a little recap of what did happen in the debate. Peterson went out to argue with a Marxist, and his opening statement was very much focused at a kind of like simplistic version of Marxism that he was taking from the Communist Manifesto, which is, you know, it's certainly not the full vision of Marxism. I'm not really a Marxist supporter, but I've been educated in those schools. I do understand it. And the Communist Manifesto actually isn't its best manifestation at all. And Peterson set out to argue with this, but that isn't who Zizek was. And when Zizek came back and talked, I don't think Zizek presented great arguments, but simply by dint of not being the Marxist demon that Peterson essentially thought he might be facing, Peterson was definitely thrown off his stride. And then their debate over the course of the next 2 hours or so was really the two of them having many, many areas of agreement. Zizek tried, because I think he is something of a showman, and he's older, he's in his 70s, he doesn't really have any high stakes, there's not much anybody can do to him if he says things that are unpopular. So he really tried to go after Peterson a couple of times. Very amusingly, he called Peterson out on where are these cultural Marxists, because in Zizek's mind, there's hardly any Marxists left. And whatever it is that Peterson is angry with isn't really Marxism. And in return, Peterson was, in a less aggressive way, articulating that he wondered then why Zizek described himself as a Marxist. And what this transformed into was two people who aren't that far apart in age, I mean, maybe 15 years, not that far apart culturally, they're both academics, both intellectuals, they both probably have a similar pool of knowledge. Ultimately, they obviously had huge areas of agreement. And one of the things they agreed on was that there was something that they fucking hated. Peterson calls this thing cultural Marxism, or maybe postmodernism. Zizek is more likely to call it political correctness. They have a number of names for it, but there's something that they don't like, and they absolutely agree that they don't like this. And really their agreement and their real reasoning for not ultimately fighting each other was that they're more concerned about this thing that they are both scared of, that they are both attacking. And this is what the real interest is in not just this debate, but in this new era of intellectual mixed martial arts. We're pitting all these ideologies against each other, and we're quickly learning a very great deal about the real shape of intellectual discourse, of politics, let's just call it politics, the real shape of politics in our world. And it isn't the shape that most of us have been inducted into through like traditional ideas of left-wing and right-wing political debate. And I think if you follow what's happening, particularly with these YouTube commentaries, you can see that the intellectual political landscape is remarkably more complex. And there are better models that we can arrive at of it. There's a large school of popular conservatism, cultural conservatism, that Peterson, despite not being really fully a cultural conservative, he's far more over into the liberal and creative side, but I think he has great empathy for conservatives. Peterson really taps into this conservative area, and it had been lost from the mainstream media, which had to become very liberal.
Now, I don't think he uses his labels consistently in this video, because one of the things he's going to do is differentiate liberal from progressive. And that's not too hard to do, and that's something that I've been working on in my videos, and we're going to do quite a bit more here. But the mainstream media has been liberal and increasingly progressive, and I think that's he's trying to figure out where the boundaries of these words lie.
Even in its right-wing formats, it still has, in Western nations anyway, Western democratic nations, a very liberal bias.
Now again, I'm not sure. I wish you would define this a little bit more, because you would say that, let's say some of the more right-wing, we'll use that language, some of the more right-wing press, National Review, Fox News, are they liberal? Yes. Are they classically liberal? Yes. And of course, Peterson has his little talk about this, but let's hear more of what this guy has to say, because that's more where I'm going with this.
So you have conservatism, and you have a very powerful school of liberalism. And these have been in a long-term conflict, maybe 3, 4, 5 even centuries of conflict.
Now, when he says that in terms of conservatism and liberalism, you can think of the sides lining up in the, let's say, the French Revolution, aspects in even the American Revolution. You've got John Adams and you've got Thomas Jefferson. And so Thomas Jefferson would be more the liberal. John Adams would be the New England Puritan. In the Netherlands, you had the anti-revolutionary party that came up, and that's long-term conservatism versus liberalism. Now, I've been trying to make a video about some of this stuff for the last number of days, and I haven't pulled it off. And now that I'm talking about it, I'm almost the video I didn't make is almost rising up from the dead now and insisting that I insert some of these slides to talk about this. But I'm sort of resisting it, because what I want to get into is that you have this conservatism, you have this classical liberalism, of which Peterson. I do want to play that. I do want to play that clip. Hang on. So before we get back to Damien Walter, I would assert that the IDW is the self-aware split between classical liberalism and, I'd call it, neo-progressivism, to distinguish it from 19th, early 20th century progressivism in America and Europe that came to its culmination in many ways through someone like Woodrow Wilson. Now, obviously, you're going to have to differentiate Woodrow Wilson from the contemporary progressives, given that they want to take down his name and his statue from Princeton University. So that's why I'm calling them neo-progressives. But, it's when Peterson was called alt-right, this was back during Charlottesville. Peterson didn't take it well, and I froze the camera. I froze the film right there when he makes this face, because the face that he made against this critic in the press was just so perfect that, well, let's play a little bit of that clip when Peterson identifies himself.
He wrote back and said, "Thank you for your response. So the article is truthful and accurate."
There it is. Again, I love it.
He wrote back and said, "Thank you for your response. So the article is truthful and accurate. How would you like to be characterized?" I said very clearly, "You mischaracterized me as far right. On what grounds whatsoever can you make that claim? And having made it, It is your responsibility to either justify the characterization with some investigation or to withdraw it and apologize. Politically, I'm a classic British liberal. Temperamentally, I'm high in openness, which tilts me to the left, although I am also conscientious, which tilts me to the right. Philosophically, I am an individualist, not a collectivist of the right or the left. Metaphysically, I'm an American pragmatist who has been strongly influenced by the psychoanalytic and clinical thinking of Freud, Jung, and the psychotherapists who have followed in their wake. There is simply nothing I have said or done that makes me far right. Quite the contrary. I've warned thousands of students over the course of 3 decades that the spirit of Auschwitz concentration camp guards dwells in their heart, and that they should do everything in their power to recognize its existence and overcome it. Every single lecture of my Maps of Meaning course, various versions which have now been watched or listened to by millions of people, make some variant of that point. I've also produced a series of individual self-development programs now used by thousands of people to strengthen themselves as individuals, determine their proper and honorable destinies, and live productive, meaningful lives. You didn't do your homework. You cast a serious aspersion on my character. I don't deserve it in the least. I want you to do something about it.
And Peterson backs up his words. I mean, you don't I mean, don't pick a fight with this guy because he will fight back. He just simply will. But now there's more going on here, and there's of course this quadrant. We've got economic left, economic right, and there's a pretty good video out on that too, which is relevant to this question of. There we go.
They're essentially for defining economics, a command Marxist economy on the far left, where the government makes all the economic decisions, and on the extreme right, a deregulated or neoliberal economy where economics are left to market forces. Yet left and right are incorrectly used to also define social positions. Take a look at the French political scene. The National Front's routinely described as extreme right, yet its economic policies are often to the left of even the French Socialist Party. But the political compass has a second dimension, the social one, that correctly shows that the economics of France's National Front are quite moderate, as is the case with many similar new so-called extreme right parties in other countries. Their extremism is in their nationalist social attitudes and policies. Conversely, President Macron's economics are far more right-wing in the sense that he's a neoliberal champion of deregulation, but his social attitudes are far more liberal than Le Pen's. If you still insist on calling a party right-wing because it's authoritarian, logic follows that the more left-wing a party is, the more liberal or anti-authoritarian it is. Do you really believe that hardline left-wingers like the North Korean leadership, Pol Pot and Stalin are shining examples of social liberalism and the free flow of ideas? Give us a break. Actually, Stalin's an interesting example. While his economics were different to Hitler's, when it comes to authoritarian rule, the social dimension, those two old tyrants had a great deal in common. Speaking of tyrants, take a different example. In 1973 in Chile, a socially liberal, democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, was toppled in a coup by a fascist free marketeer, Augusto Pinochet. A lot of thinking became muddled when Europe's old communist Eastern Bloc countries fell, and they got both democracy and a free market at the same time. This led to the notion that the two are inextricably linked. They're not, as we've just seen in the Chilean example. Well, that's a very brief account of our work. The political compass is much more than the absolutely anonymous test that it's best known for. It places you on its chart and offers you a free personalized certificate.
Okay, so that's the political compass, and it's a cool little test, and it's worthwhile taking, but it gets to the point here about what is Damon Walker talking about, because we're talking about Zizek and Peterson. Now, Peterson is a classical liberal. Zizek seems to be something of he styles himself to be a Marxist. He certainly has some collectivist leanings in terms of, he says that nations will need to be cooperative in order to address things like the ocean, some of this, but he, didn't have much good to say about China. So, but we're still not quite getting to what the main point that Damian Walter is making in this. So let's keep going. I just wanted to throw some of those definitions out so we didn't stumble upon them later on.
Liberalism really began to emerge into the world and challenge of conflict. Since liberalism really began to emerge into the world and challenge conservatism, these two schools have been fighting each other. And in a way, they're traditionally what we think of by the right wing, conservatism, and the left wing, liberalism. But you throw into this two other ideas. One is socialism, which you might think of as the far left, and it has a political history of something like 100, 150 years, and it has a very problematic history. Attempts to establish socialism have failed badly, with death tolls of millions of people. In Europe, we've had a more democratic socialism, which never went quite as far in America, but still it's out there as well. And Zizek is, he's undoubtedly a socialist in his view. He buys into this school. What he isn't is a progressive. And I think this is what we really saw partially articulated in the Zizek-Peterson event, and it's why they didn't fight. And Peterson representing conservatism and some aspects you might call classical liberalism. Zizek, who really in most ways is liberally minded, but is also a strong socialist, so they kind of bridge this political spectrum that we're more familiar with.
See, and again, Peterson representing conservatism, but you're using the word conservative in a very different way. You're using the word conservative as someone who is resisting change, let's say, which is different from, say, a label of conservatism that we might use. So Peterson is acting like a classical liberal, all right, because I think that's the best way to categorize him in many ways. He's not, but whether or not he looks conservative in his impulse, understanding conservative as resistant to change, obviously depends greatly on the context. And the context has been moving pretty significantly since the Cold War. And Damian's going to get into that in a minute.
Neither of them are progressives. And they both...
And now when we get into this question of progressives, and what we're going to understand, that progressivism, or this neo-progressivism, is a very religious movement, and I've been talking about that with respect to the grievance study hoaxers, Bret Weinstein, and what he experienced. But the real question I want to get at is, what is the difference between the eschatology of liberalism and the eschatology of progressivism? And so I'm going to have to define eschatology a little bit for those of you who aren't comfortable with that word yet, because both perspectives on the world naturally seek an end, a telos, something that they're looking for. They all have within them a vision of the good life. And what we've seen is the differentiation, the split of liberalism and progressivism, and especially this new, rather aggressive kind of progressivism that both Peterson and Zizek could come together and find friendship in opposing. Even though Peterson's a classical liberal, Zizek's far harder to nail down. I call Peterson a hopeful humanist, Zizek more of a merry pessimist.
As many people do, confuse progressive politics with liberal politics. Because undoubtedly progressive politics, you can really date to the kind of the 60s counterculture, the civil rights program. Progressive politics did grow out of liberal ideals and liberal political campaigns, but they're really clearly no longer the same thing. And in many ways, if you look at left-wing politics today, this emerging split between centrists, liberal centrists, who in the UK were represented by politicians like Tony Blair, in America like Bill Clinton, Barack Obama to an extent, liberal centrist politics is itself very scared and misunderstanding progressive politics, because progressive politics is becoming something radically different. You see this often in arguments about science, the sciences, which I can't quite strongly with Peterson and kind of the people he debates with, that liberalism is very attached to the sciences. There might be times when it rejects scientific ideals because they don't quite fit with liberal principles, but it's largely liberalism and science work, hand in hand together. Progressivism isn't necessarily so happy with science.
Now, right there, you have the IDW. That is exactly where they come into the picture, because liberalism continues to endorse this monarchical, objectivist perspective and approach to the world that has been so powerful with respect to science and technology, and humanity, especially in the West, have achieved significant gains in terms of economics, in terms of power through technology, in terms of our ability to marshal and colonize the material world and make it serve us. These are the great triumphs of liberalism, okay? Of classical liberalism. This is what we have. And so when Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Bret Weinstein, and the others see this new progressivism, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, Helen Procros, all in a sense classical liberals, they see this new progressivism and understand it to be highly religious. And they begin to notice the similarities that they find between elements of Christianity and progressivism. Now, I know when I say words like this, many conservative Christians take a step back, but you have to understand that almost everything in the Western world that we are dealing with now, including Sam Harris, whether he likes to admit it or not, is all downstream from Christianity. And so the progressivism leverages elements of Christianity in order to make its point. And this is why certain elements of the progressivism very much fit into certain elements of the Christian church. These are not alien streams. These are not alien arguments. They all flow together. And that's why I have in many ways said that the Western culture war is a Christendom civil war. The Western culture war is a variety of strains of Christianity and readings within it competing against each other. And now what we're really seeing is the differentiation of liberalism, in Jordan Peterson's case, as we call it, classic liberalism, from progressivism. Part of the difficulty we're having in terms of talking about this is that often we use liberal and conservative as liberal as those who are more for change and conservative as those who are more resistant to change. That's really a misuse, I think, more of the word liberal. Okay, because when we're talking about classical liberalism in the Jordan Peterson sense, we're really talking about what holds Jordan Peterson and let's say even Steven Pinker and Sam Harris together, this perspective on the world. And within that, there's also a perspective with respect to education and politics and religion. All of that has come together, and all of that is now sort of fragmenting as progressivism is increasingly differentiating itself from this older liberalism. And that is why liberals like Jordan Peterson are increasingly seen as conservatives, because they are resisting this change, even though they are quite accurately called liberal. So this is complex in terms of minding the labels and watching how these things are changing.
If science has things to say about gender differences, about a whole range of issues.
Let me back this up a little bit.
Scientific ideals because they don't quite fit with liberal principles, but it's largely liberalism and science work, hand in hand together. Progressivism isn't necessarily so happy with science. If science has things to say about gender differences, about a whole range of issues, these might be rejected rightly or wrongly, I don't have a clear opinion on that yet, by progressives, because progressive values are not liberal values. Progressive values are something else. And progressive politics has become more and more powerful. So, maybe its biggest champion, very recent on the field, AOC.
Now, I'm going to drop another slide, but that video that I didn't make just simply won't die. So my friend Mr. Reagan made a video that launched his career on AOC, and he made the point that AOC got her position via a casting call. And this gets into the question of social media and how social media is doing an end around the gatekeepers. And AOC she's an avatar. Now, I'm not trying to take anything away from her as a person, but the point that Andrew Klavan made to Mr. Reagan's video, I thought was exactly right. That pointing out that AOC responded to a casting call. This is a development of congressional politics. This isn't the point Andrew Klavan made, but he said that's just politics, because moneyed interest groups looked for figureheads and principalities to inhabit and to express the principality of the community. And we've been doing this in presidential campaigns for a very long time, but as the power of social media has grown, we've had more and more power and ability to bring this down even to 2-year congressional campaigns. And so a group of Justice Democrats decided to cast AOC, this very charismatic, good-looking, sharp young woman, into the role of progressivist lightning rod and leader. So this is very much happening here. Back to this.
The new congresswoman in America, and she is undoubtedly like a spearhead of progressive politics.
See, that's how she's seen. But again, she is in fact she's embodying the principality for the group, the interest group that brought her forward. And again, that's not to say anything against her. That's simply how politics works. Andrew Klavan is dead right about Mr. Reagan's video. Now, maybe this is taking on new expressions and morphing in new ways because of social media and the parties themselves, which were supposed to be the gatekeepers. You saw that in the 2016 election, because, of course, the Republican gatekeepers kept trying to hold Trump back, but he just destroyed their gates and took over the party. And on the left, the Democrats were more successful in sandbagging Bernie Sanders so that Hillary Clinton should be coronated, only to go on to lose against Donald Trump. So now this new wave of progressivism, which is exemplified, that's probably the best word, in AOC. And so this non-American journalist is watching this drama and noticing the differentiation between the liberals and the progressives.
Many liberal politicians do not understand what she represents. And she represents really an entirely new political paradigm. And this paradigm it's powerful. It's only possibly a small number of people who really embody progressive values as opposed to liberal values at the moment. But even if they're only like 10, 15% of the politically active population, they have a huge and growing influence. They're clearly very influential in the universities, colleges, and academia. They have growing influence in the media, where more and more people in the media aren't necessarily liberal, they're progressive. They have very progressive aims. Technology companies in Silicon Valley is a very politically progressive community. And you've seen that with platforms like Twitter, Google, and their attitudes to the political voices that they sometimes use to silence on their platforms. Now, I would have to define myself as a progressive politically. also coming into that from a socialist ethos, because they have a very strong relationship as well. In some ways, you could say that socialism as it emerged at the beginning of the century was the Mark 0.1, the pre-release beta of progressivism. And that says some things about progressive ideologies. But even as a progressive thinker, I think I can look at the way progressive politics is emerging into the world and agree that along with the power that progressive politics is taking, it's hugely aggressive. I can be very, very aggressive in debate. I have been in the past, and I now try to temper that with a better understanding of the people I'm talking to. But you look generally at the dialogues that are coming to dominate, particularly the mainstream media at the moment, and online platforms like Twitter particularly. It's very progressive. It's hugely aggressive. And I don't think that can be denied. It might be right to be aggressive. That's possible. I think when you were looking at issues like civil rights and what was needed to drive that through, the aggressive parts of progressive politics were necessary, nigh essential.
Now, right there, you have the drama, because essentially he's religiously, I would argue, a progressive. That is his eschatology. And when he makes the value judgment that it's right to push it through. Now, here you have the question. Was the American civil rights movement, which was lots of books in my office on Dr. Martin Luther King, given where and how I grew up. Was this a progressive movement? I'd say, yeah, coming out of the 19th century, it was a very Christian movement. So now we have the relationship between Christianity and progressivism, and now Christian eschatology is obviously split three ways. You have the post-millennials who imagine a gradual improvement of the world. You have the premillennial dispensationalists who imagine we're heading towards, there's a rapture, and then there's end times, and then there's the Antichrist and all of that. Then you have the amillennials, which is actually the majority of majority numbers wise, I don't know, but Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Reformed, all the non-dispensational traditions that are amil, which manage Christian eschatology differently. But this all gets played out in thought, in life, and in culture. And what we've had is this liberalism, and this liberalism did give birth to a progressivism, but the liberalism takes some of the progressive ethos of Christianity and gives it a secular form. But I'm going to argue that liberalism, classical liberalism itself, was fairly weak on eschatology, whereas progressivism is a strengthening of this eschatological impulse within it to arrive at this highly moral crusade and mandate towards a particular vision of the world. Now, at my meetup Sunday night, one of the people there who never wears a name tag, one of the people there came in and said something to the effect that, I'm going to rephrase it and paraphrase it a little bit, but when he said it, I stopped him. I said, I want to hear what you have to say about this. Because he basically said, and we were talking a little bit about the Mike Naina, am I saying his name properly? He did this great 3-part series on Bret Weinstein and Evergreen, which is a terrific series. I highly recommend it. I'm not going to play any of it here, but it's a terrific series. And what this individual at the meetup said was basically Bret set the table with the steak knives used to attack him. That the students of Evergreen were essentially setting up the professors were setting up the students to do what they did. And Bret was part of that movement. Now, again, Bret would identify himself more with the IDW as a classic liberal, but this, and I love the I love the title of the second one, Teaching to Transgress, because these students didn't get this from no place. And the person at the meetup was saying, or another person at the meetup was actually saying, actually what happens when you get a situation like Evergreen, once a college starts signaling itself in terms of this progressivism, it's going to continue to attract students and professors, and you're going to get an intensification of this spirit of progressivism, this it's going to get embodied in a principality and in various principalities, but you're going to basically summon this spirit of progressivism, and it's going to accelerate, it's going to purify, and what you're going to see very quickly is it reach its end. It's going to reach its telos, and very quickly you're going to be able to see whether or not the spirit of this principality, whether or not this spirit is unstable. And if you follow Benjamin Boyce's ongoing treatment of this, and Bret Weinstein and Mike Naina's channel on this, you'll see that it has in fact become highly unstable, and it is self-destructive, and it cannot stand, it cannot last. It is a house divided against itself. And it's what happens is that the gravity, it's sort of like a black hole, that there's so much mass that comes into this, and with more mass it attracts more and more and more, and then it eventually just implodes in on itself. The gravity sucks everything in, and it can't be stable. So now they're going to fire the president, and they're not going to be able to find anyone pure enough to embody it, because the spirit of this is where you get into the spirit of this personality. This is where you get into theological, biblical, eschatological languages. The prince of progressivism cannot last because he is finally unstable. This is a point that Jesus makes about Satan, and people say Jesus is casting out demons in Satan's name, and Jesus is saying, you don't understand how things work. Such a house cannot stand. So Evergreen cannot stand, and they are demonstrating that this spirit cannot last, because at its heart there are elements to it which cannot really work, and they prove themselves to be finally unstable. And this is in fact the argument that not with respect to progressivism, but with understanding what heresies are. Alistair McGrath, scholar out of England, makes that point in his great little book on heresies, that finally what heresies are threads of Christianity. Christian heresies are threads of Christianity that eventually reach their ends and show themselves to be unstable, and so that they in fact die off and don't last. And so what we've had here is that we had, obviously, Christianity grows into the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment continues to refine and develop in terms of what we would call classic liberalism. And that classic liberalism will have an eschatology built into it. Every worldview has an eschatological vision or framework, and one of the things that I do when I listen to people like Zizek or Peterson or Bret Weinstein or the people at Evergreen is I always listen for their eschatology, because in many ways by their eschatology you can know them. What is in fact their ethos, their spirit pointing towards, and then when you have instances of experimentation of those eschatologies, you have to ask, are they stable? In a number of the conversations, I've been thinking about a book I read a couple of years ago, which was really a tremendous book. The title of the book was Oneida, Free Love and a Well-Set Table. And what that was a story of the Oneida community at the end of the 19th century in upstate New York that embodied a certain spirit, a certain principality. And part of the reason that history is so fascinating to study is because what history is a living laboratory in spirits and principalities and powers as people try to work them out and experiment with them, and you can see which ones actually become highly unstable and devolve and go away. And so here we have the question. So you have Jordan Peterson, Bret Weinstein, Sam Harris, those embodying classic liberalism. And Now the progressivists are taking this in a very religious direction, and it's becoming highly unstable and quite destructive fairly quickly. And so many of the classical liberals are now cast in a position as conservatives as such. And again, that's not a political label, that's a relative label in terms of change versus no change. These are people that are saying, ho, 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 slow down, slow down. But what you don't often hear is, or what is seldom pointed out, is that often within liberalism, you have the seeds of progressivism, but they'll say things, well, we're not ready for that yet. Okay? And you had that, let's say, in the 2012 presidential campaign when the topic was gay marriage. And Hillary Clinton was, for example, for civil unions. Remember those civil unions? Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party was all for civil unions. And if you would get them behind closed doors, they'd say something like, well, we're not ready for gay marriage yet. And of course, you had the Supreme Court decision in 2015, which took it out of the political landscape in terms of legislatures and pretty much locked things into the courts. But you can notice then within liberalism a certain oh, that video is coming back strong. I'm going to stick in another slide. That there's a certain atmosphere and presumption even among properly labeled conservatives that they are always on the losing side. Some of you might remember that a few weeks ago I made a video on riffing on some of the stuff from the Distributist channel on why the left keeps winning. And actually, the Distributist showed up at our meetup Sunday night, which was awfully fun to meet him. And his voice is exactly like it is on YouTube. And so we had a lot of fun with him on Sunday night. And he poses the question, why does the left always win? And to me, one of the interesting things is, why do conservatives always imagine they are losing? And the Distributist is the one that says this too. Now, what's interesting about the kind of funny dynamics in our culture is that in many ways the left always has to keep propping up the other side to say, oh, we're continuing to lose against them. And you can actually hear Zizek make that comment that, well, Bernie Sanders is just promoting a watered down version of what has been in Europe for a long time. And so it's not apparent. So the right likes to pose as if the left always wins, and the left likes to pose as if the right always wins, and so they both play the victim against each other. But then the Distributist made this slide about conservative drift and how you continue to see it from 1518 to 1618 to 1718 to 1818 to 1918 to 2018. You look at this and it says, well, there seems to be this drift to the left, but now you're going to have to define exactly what is left and what is right. And then I talked about technology, and you can watch that video if you're interested in. But so again, we have to look at the eschatologies of these different principalities and say, well, what do they seek? And now I'm going to argue that the eschatology of liberalism is fundamentally weak, that as a worldview, it doesn't have much of an eschatology, which means that when that eschatological fervor, or we might even argue within a Christendom context, the millennial fervor gets going when our enthusiasms, to use a Jonathan Edwards word, when our enthusiasms really get rolling, you get this progressivism. And so what you have when you think about the 20th century into the 21st century, you had this fight against communism in the Cold War and the final defeat against communism, and Zizek is sort of a clown figure who comes up and wants to embody the corpse of communism as a trickster, as a way of not being able to be placed anywhere on the board so that he can critique everything else on the board, because his eschatology is basically it's all lost. It's all lost. And so we cannot afford an eschatology. That seems to be mostly Zizek's position. Peterson, again, continues to be a classical liberal, but because of the progressives, both Zizek and Peterson are skeptical of the progressives and will essentially gang up against the progressives. And in fact, Damon makes this point, which we'll let him finish off here.
But you look now at people like Zizek, people like Peterson, who are older, who clearly aren't progressives. They rail against manifestations of progressive politics like postmodernism, like cultural Marxism, if indeed such a thing exists. I think that's debatable. Like political correctness, which I tend to agree with. But they rail against these things because to them they seem very aggressive. They seem like liberalism gone crazy because they don't understand that progressive politics is an entirely new stage of politics.
See, and that's exactly where my friend at the meetup said, no, it's a development of the liberalism. And so the parents fear, that the liberal parents fear their progressive children.
Whether it's a valid stage, whether it's right, whether it's going to win, is a different video. I might make that video at some point, but I don't think it's stretching the case too far. But if you look at what happened in the debate between Peterson and Zizek, if you look at why they didn't fight, it's because ultimately they're a conservative and a socialist, both with strong liberal tendencies.
No, they're a liberal and a socialist.
Who are terrified of progressive politics and what it's coming to represent. And this new era of intellectual MMA is going to really get interesting when progressive fighters enter it. Because at the moment, perhaps because progressive journalists, writers have something of a stranglehold on a lot of mainstream media sources, a lot of progressive thinkers aren't entering these fights. They're not big on platforms like YouTube. But that is definitely going to change. And I think those debates, there won't be any no fighting.
Now, I think Damian Walter is wrong on the first part of the video, which I didn't play, when he's quoting Joe Rogan mixed martial arts. And I think he's wrong because of another YouTube channel that I just discovered that I'm going to play, because I found a lot of videos that I have a lot of interest in on his channel, and I'll play him in a minute. But here's the question. Can the liberals and the progressives talk? One of the things that people have noted in the Zizek-Peterson debate was that the crowd had very much two sides. You had your Peterson fans, you had your Zizek fans, okay? And so they come into that, and they're two sides, and they can't talk. One of the things that I noted in, let's say, the Dominican Republic, when I was in the Dominican Republic, is that it's often the case that two groups that are very close together can't work productively with one another. There's just too much hostility and enmity. I noted how often in the Dominican Republic it was easier for Puerto Ricans to work with Haitians than it was for Dominicans to work with Haitians. And that's because Dominicans and Haitians share the same island. They have a long history of being together. They're just too close to work with one another. And you'll often see this generationally. There's a different relationship between children and grandparents than there are between children and parents, because children and parents are so close. All of the internal expectations, hopes, dreams that everybody has a handle on are just simply too powerful in terms of the dynamic for them to work productively together. Now, Damian Walter makes the important point that this was not the fight that anyone was looking for. Everyone was imagining we're going to have Jordan Peterson, the classical liberal Westerner capitalist, versus the classical Marxist, but you can't find Marxists anymore. Not, that was Zizek's point, not real Marxist. And very few people are willing to continue to support and defend the kind of Marxism we saw in the middle of the 20th century, exemplified by the Soviet Union or Maoist China, that the bodies just stack up too large. And so Peterson is obviously sniffing around and saying, there's still some Marxism in here somewhere that we'd better call out. But Damien says, well, the real fireworks you're going to see are between the progressives and the liberals. And that's exactly right. And then Damon said, well, now we're going to wait for this mixed martial arts between the progressives and the liberals, and they're going to fight each other, and that's going to be something to see. But I have my doubts because of what came up just in the news a little bit ago, which was a big thing in New York Mag, not a conservative publication, The Intelligencer, inside the meltdown of Roxane Gay and Christina Hoff Sommers' Australian mini tour. And this is a terrific article to just sort of read through. And basically what this comes down to is what the hoaxers have been learning, which is progressives have a real difficulty playing with others. Well, why? Well, you see this obviously in religious camps as well, because your ethos gets so powerful that you simply must destroy anyone else who comes later. And in fact, trying to host these conversations, which, well, let me play a little bit of the beginning of this. I mean, even look at the body language. These people do not like each other. The fact that they can stay on stage and not come to blows seems, they're looking to punch Nazis, and everyone right of them is a Nazi.
I just think it'd be nice if we had this evening. Four.
Look at the introduction here. Listen to what happens.
I know what you're thinking. What is this penis doing on stage?
Notice how he defines himself simply by his sex. Notice what this penis... He has become a penis. This is what happens in identity politics. And it's a joke, but it's not a joke.
My name is Desha Miller. I'm the founder of This Is 42 and also Thinking. I'm also a filmmaker. That doesn't really answer your question. Let me tell you a story. I've been organizing events like this around Australia and New Zealand for well over a decade. And we always put a lot of thought behind these events, and we always think ahead who's going to host these events. And we normally have quite a list. So when the time came, I put the word out. I sent out an email to a well-known journalist. It took her 10 minutes. She responded saying, "No thanks." Unusual. Sent another email to another journalist. Now she took half an hour. She came back saying, "I would like to politely decline." I reached out to a few more people. One of them did the polite thing and said, "Hey, I'm really busy right now. I'll get back to you. I'm still waiting." And the next person didn't respond. And the next person. You can see what's happening. For some reason, no self-proclaimed feminists wanted to host this event. Actually, nobody wanted to host this event.
People are not dumb.
So, as an immigrant, I'm doing the job that nobody wants to do. I will be the first to admit, I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge about the subject matter. But I am a curious mind. I want to learn. Jokes aside, I know what happens when we do not engage in difficult conversation, when we do not speak to groups of people we disagree with. See, I was born into a country of civil war. I've only known my country, Sri Lanka, as a country of war. I've seen things that nobody should see. And when the war finished, I went back and did some reconciliation work. And one thing we learned, 70% of my countrymen did not have a friend or engage in meaningful conversation with the other. When you otherize a group of people, it's easy to hate. Or 100,000 of my people died. I know it's a very serious note, but I'm simply suggesting that we need to engage in better conversation. And for thousands of years, Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation, the custodians of this land, have had meaningful conversations. And with their blessing and yours, I would like to attempt to facilitate such a conversation. Sound good? Okay. So please help me welcome our first guest. She's an award-winning American author, a philosopher, a university professor, and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Please give a warm welcome to Christina Hoff Sommers.
Hello.
And you can watch that video on your own if you want to. But here's the point. What's going on here? And this, of course, has been the center of the IDW. Can, now that as progressivism morphs out of this area that has been dominated by the victory of classical liberalism, can they actually negotiate the separation? Or will it become War of the Roses? So my goal here is to look at what's behind the liberal agenda, because I think it's pretty clear, it's increasingly clear the religious nature of this new progressivism, of this neo-progressivism. Actually, I think the religious nature of 19th century progressivism was abundantly obvious. It was basically Christian post-millennialism that was expressed and worked through the culture, which was actually ground into the mud of the battlefields of Belgium and France in the First World War. But what is behind, so here's the question. You have this new progressivism that has developed. What is it growing out of? Part of the difficulty we have is we can't see our own assumptions, and that things get so built into a culture we don't see another way, which again is why it's helpful to read history and look at history, because you have living laboratories of human beings who are living differently from we do, have different assumptions from what we have, right in different ways than what we have. And so then I found this guy who had made a commentary on the Peterson Zizek. Oh, there, I didn't make a link. Hang on. Okay, this channel, Zella Soma. Interesting videos. Did some commentary on Peterson and Sam Harris that I didn't see, which I'm watching now, which I'm very much appreciating. And now this video on Zizek and Peterson. So let's take a listen to what he has to say.
Zizek made a point that happiness is not something in itself that we should be aiming at. And in that, I absolutely agree.
And of course, it's Peterson's point too.
The pursuit of happiness, which has been paraded by popular culture for decades, no, even centuries actually, because remember, it was the Enlightenment thinkers who put forward the notion that mankind should migrate towards happiness.
Okay, and there's your eschatological marker for the Enlightenment, that happiness is what we should be shooting for. And in fact, you can find this in Thomas Jefferson's Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, where he slightly alters John Locke's formulation. So now we're beginning to, well, what then is the eschatology of the Enlightenment? Well, it's that we can marshal for ourselves the circumstantial the circumstances by which we derive happiness, and this comes through control, this comes through prosperity, this comes through all of the different aspects of the material around us in order to achieve happiness. And I would say this is the eschatology of the Enlightenment.
So we should see this for what it is. A cultural narrative, an image of positive potential that we can strive towards, if of course we subscribe to all of the other tenets that are sold to us as the catalysts that'll take us towards such a beautiful goal. It's interesting actually, because when you think about it, liberal society prescribes itself in the same manner as a cult system like Scientology. You don't just buy into one part of it. You have to buy into the whole set of mantras and mandates and narratives that it sells to you under the false promise that by doing so you will be emancipated, you will be free.
Now that's a key word here, because again, you've got Jordan Peterson calls it postmodern neo-Marxism. Neil Shenvi calls it critical theory. I call it progressive liberationism, because what this progressivism does is say that what freedom is constraint. And this constraint can be explicit, or, and this is where the neo-progressivism goes, it's all this implicit constraints. And so what we have to do is free people from these implicit constraints, and then you have the identity markers that mark out all of these other constraints by the oppressors. So we must free people from these oppressors. Now again, this is built on Enlightenment eschatology of happiness and the assumptions around it.
You will be enlightened. You will, that by doing so, you will be emancipated. You will be free. You will be enlightened. You will find happiness. And in that system is the ultimate form of slavery, a slavery that sells itself to you as the ultimate freedom, a poison that offers itself as the ultimate remedy. The very genius, I think, of our liberal capitalist project is how it is able to saturate its influence into every single fiber of our being, and how we conceptualize ourselves as living creatures in history. On one level, it stands as a development from the feudal and theocratic systems of old, which, even though through its own narrative demeans and calls regressive, liberal capitalism succeeds where those systems have failed. What I mean is that those older systems were limited in their means to effect influence by the constraints of communication and technological development in their time. Liberal capitalism has evolved past a post-industrial project into the internet communications age, which it has been able to successfully harness a method of interface never before witnessed in any other human society, meaning that its ability to manipulate the perceptual and conceptual drives of living creatures is more effective than any other method of interface, and it has been even more successful in that it has exported this model of development to the entire world, setting the standard in sub-variations of itself for how we operate as an organism on Earth. That is incredibly significant.
I love that point that he makes, and this point was actually made by Scott Alexander in his blog Slate Star Codex in this post from 2016, How the West Was Won, and he talks about this culture that the West has had, which has won again and again, and talks about it not as Western culture, but as, basically as common culture. Now, do I have this? Oh, maybe I have the wrong blog post. Hang on. Let me make sure I've got the right one. Yeah, it is the right article. Because he goes from Western culture to talk about universal culture. And he comes to this paragraph like this. On one hand, universal culture is objectively better. Now pay attention to the word objective again. Its science is more correct. Its economy will grow faster. Its soft drinks are more refreshing. Its political systems are necessarily freer. This is really the voice of modernism coming through. And this is where the children of modernism or neo-progressivism really begin to say, no, it's not better. We want to tear this house down. And you almost get to Dostoevsky's Piano Keys. If you give people the perfect world, they will want to destroy it. It seems, continues. I got some pastor stuff to take care of. So Slate Star Codec here, voices the big argument. It also seems morally better. Tibetans did gouge out the eyes of would-be runaway serfs. I realize the circularity of saying that universal culture is objectively morally better based on it seeming to be so. A universal culture member, but I am prepared to suspend that paradox in favor of not wanting people's eyes gouged out for resisting slavery. On the other hand, I think that universal culture is what every society would select if given the opportunity, is less of a knockdown point than it would seem. Heroin use is something every society would select if given the opportunity. That is, if nobody placed censorship on the spread of heroin and would be spread from country to country, becoming a major part of the world society. Instead, we implement an almost authoritarian level of control on it because we know that even though it would be widely adopted, it's not something that is good for anyone in the long term. An opponent of universal culture could say it has the same property. So again, in one of the nice pieces, and I'll put the link here, Slate Star Codex, 2016, July 25, How the West Was Won. He goes into some of this analysis about what is essentially liberal Western culture that has become universal culture. And I really love the way this new channel articulates how powerful it has been, but understand that it itself is a thing. And its values are not necessarily ultimate or beyond questioning. And so, in a way, when you listen to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris talk, Peterson is like, yeah, it's good, it's great, all that, but it has underpinnings which, Sam, you are not fully appreciating, and maybe its goodness is not as self-evident as you would imagine it to be.
Sub-variations of itself for how we operate as an organism on Earth. That is incredibly significant. And it's also succeeded where every fragile tyranny and dictatorship has failed. Because in those systems, the tyrant had to oppress you in the old-fashioned way. Whereas our system works precisely because it gets you to oppress yourself. And the genius of it is that in doing so, you further believe that you are becoming more free. As you scale up in society, you believe that you are on some superior mission towards happiness and wealth and success in life. And in a sense you are, but you are always, in effect, perpetuating the health and wealth of the artificial systems around you. You are essentially a living battery, as supplied by the image in the Matrix movie. So if the ancient theocratic city-states could ever be called tyrannies, then what we live under is the ultimate form of tyranny, because it's been able to change what we are so thoroughly and gaslight us into believing that we're free from oppression and slavery, when in fact we are only free in a superficial sense. We are enslaved in all of the ways that are really important at the level of our being, our soul, our organism. And like any other society in history, liberal society creates narratives which are designed to reconcile ourselves to the state of life as we experience it and put us in accord with the rest of history that has come before us. An interesting thing about liberalism as well, and the reason why we're talking about liberalism is because it's the ultimate promoter of this topic of happiness, is that it runs on a narrative that sees itself outside of all narratives, like how it routinely mocks Christian mythology.
Now, this point he makes here is really important, because one of the ironies that if you're a liberal, more like me, you've got huge amount of liberalism built into me. For the most part, when I listen to Peterson talk about classical liberalism, I say, yeah, that's right. I value that. I believe in all of these tenets of classic liberalism, freedom of religion. I vote in every election. I participate in all of this. This is deeply built into me. But when I look at postmodernism and they're decrying narratives, it's like, oh yeah, but you're a narrative too. Well, to what degree is liberalism also a narrative? Which is, of course, what the postmoderns are saying, which gets to the deeper point that we don't see our own assumptions. We don't see our own systems. And so often the only way to see your own system is to leave where you've been, turn around and look back at it from a distance.
Whilst it runs on a narrative that sees itself outside of all narratives.
And this would, in many ways, articulate Sam Harris, because Sam Harris doesn't imagine he's seeing in narratives. He's just seeing a space of objects. He's not really seeing the narrative that surrounds him.
Like how it routinely mocks Christian mythology, whilst all the time failing to recognize the mythology that it lives under. And another narrative that I find fascinating that was connected to these talks is how the salvation narrative evolves through time, and how in a previous iteration of our existence this was attempted through a direct appeal to nature or through a symbolic image of Christ who died for our sins on the cross. And now this salvation narrative has been carried over beyond both man and nature into a salvation through technology. The most wild exhibition.
And there you begin to get, again, the eschatology of liberalism. But now what happens with neoprogressivism is you have this, you assume this liberal technology, you assume this liberal eschatology through technology, and you add on to it new social technologies that are supposed to yield the kinds of soft liberation from the kinds of soft oppression that are supposed to be endemic among us.
Of this would be in the emerging cult of transhumanism, which is a religious outgrowth of liberalism. And Zizek holds a deep apprehension, as do I, when he briefly touched on the dangers that face us in the future with the expansion of ideas such as the singularity and neural network systems. But he dropped the idea and moved on to something else, so I'd just like to talk about it now. This is a consequence of untrammeled technology, scientism, and the unchecked tyranny of modern expansionism. And I know precisely how all of this is going to get trotted out. It's going to be sold to us using the same false positive platitudic persuasions that they always are, as a cure, as a salvation, as something that will augment happiness. They'll probably get some kid with autism on a TED stage and show what this wonder device did for him and how we should learn to accept and tolerate the machine as it insidiously moves in to redefine our humanity. Look, I'm no Luddite. I love technology. I use it every day to do my creative work. But I am also deeply suspicious of any effort that views technology as ascendant to nature. Nature comes first, and the fact that we're natural beings comes first, as is the reality that we've spent more time in natural situations than in techno-city states. And the permanence of that historical effect lives on through us, whether we like it or not. Therefore, we must always work with nature and mistrust technology, because nature is our foundation, and technology is a creative condiment which allows us to work with and manipulate nature. But we are always subservient to the realities of our organic heritage.
And that's where he talks about his filter. And I would, if I were having a conversation with him, I would probably say, okay, but you're going to have to explain to me how, and I don't know his fuller worldview. He seems to be a Jungian. He talks about Jung a fair amount. And so I don't really understand his complete worldview, but once you make the move of differentiating humanity from nature, you cross a line that most people don't pay any attention to, but it's really a fairly significant line. Now, this line was built into Western history via Christianity, via the first chapters of Genesis, because here you have that line where human beings are image bearers of God, which not only afford us a certain degree of rights, but also a certain amount of privilege with respect to our exercise over nature and colonizing of nature. Now, in all of this, now I thought those points were great, but I want to bring in John Vervaeke, because in the most recent video that he played, I thought he really nicely laid out a point that helps us see this technological embedding within liberalism in a helpful new way. Because what he does throughout this course, and as he's on to, I think this is episode 14, he differentiates the having versus being mode and the agent-agency arena. And all of those are very helpful if we're going to pause and say, okay, we have liberalism and we have neo-progressivism, and what is the eschatology of liberalism? How does that work? And I think Zina Soma, I don't have to look up his name, nicely articulated the eschatology of liberalism, this kind of scientistic vision. It's kind of a Star Trek vision, if you will, the scientistic vision of now with technology we can overcome nature, we can colonize nature, and by virtue of taking hold of nature, taking control of our circumstances, taking control of our environment, taking control of nature, now we can secure and produce for ourselves the happiness that we want. But now pay attention, within this narrative, within this frame of reference, happiness is a function of colonizing and controlling the circumstances and points of our life. And what Vervaeke is going to note is that throughout the history of philosophy, we have in fact seen the futility of that and dealt with that through various philosophical systems. So let's jump into Vervaeke at this point.
Now, well, I think mortality salience is definitely a part of the Hellenistic crisis. I don't think the Epicureans have a comprehensive understanding. And to get a more comprehensive understanding and diagnosis, we turn to the Stoics. But in order to understand the Stoics, we have to understand the group that they developed out of. Those were the Cynics. And the Cynics were not as impressed by Socrates' argumentation as Plato was. They were much more impressed by Socrates' capacity for confrontation and provocatively inducing aporia in people. And they started to practice this. And in doing so, they started to force people to realize the distinction between moral codes and purity codes, and to thereby pay more careful attention to what they're actually setting their hearts upon, so that their hearts would not be broken by being set on man-made, impermanent cultural systems and values. Zeno, a Cynic, was deeply impressed by this, but he was also impressed by Plato's argumentation. He wanted to integrate the two together. And he also had the fundamental insight that although particular cultures and historical institutions are contingent, being social is not. We are inherently social in the depths of our humanity. So leaving the polis was not actually an option, according to Zeno. Instead, what we have to do is realize that our issue isn't what we're setting our hearts upon, but how we're setting our hearts. Pay much more attention to the process than the product. So you can see how the Stoics are even picking up on something that's implicit in the Epicureans. The Epicureans aren't trying to change the world and eradicate death by bringing about immortality. The Epicureans are trying to get you to reframe, have an insight, not just an intellectual insight, but an existential insight that changes the meaning of your mortality. And this was the core of the Stoic insight. Pay attention to how that existential meaning is being made. Pay attention to how that process of co-identification, the way we're assuming and assigning identities, is occurring, because that's where your self and your identity and your agency are being forged. The problem is most of us let that process go by mindlessly, automatically, and reactively. And so we mar this process. We make it susceptible to distortion. And that distortion is going to be a distortion that affects the very machinery of our self, of our being in the world.
Now let's pause here, because it's helpful to note that let's say the default setting of us is in fact the the realm in which the liberalist eschatology functions. You can make an alligator happy by giving him warm water and throwing chicken into his tank, and he will sit there happily. You can keep people happy by giving them television, bread, and circuses. If you continue to satisfy their material wants, their material needs, and some of their basic entertainment and sexual needs, it's amazing how docile you can keep a human being. And for this reason, this level for us is so primary that if, as we have managed in the modern realm, managed to satisfy the needs of a population, these fundamental needs at a population at a huge level, throughout the world. And this is in some ways the Peterson and Zizek when they're talking about the good, and Peterson is like, look at what we've been able to do. People are satisfied because they are hungry or because they have food and they have all of these things that liberalism has been able to give to them. And a lot of this technology that Vervaeke is talking about, practiced in the ancient Greeks, obviously practiced in an age of quite a bit more instability, quite a bit more poverty, quite a bit more want, and that want then forces the populations to achieve other goods via, they're going to separate, in a sense, ourselves from ourselves. And this is the dynamic that produces this axial age where life here is below, but the real world is up in heaven. Okay, and the tension between them to split the world so that we can take the suffering and we can segregate it down here, but we can therefore hope for this land, pie in the sky by and by, where everything will be great. Okay, but what happens with liberalism and modernity is, well, now we're functioning, we're satisfying the needs and wants of people down here. And who needs philosophy if you have cable TV and HBO and a modern supermarket down the road and enough money to buy everything you want and take lovely vacations and so on and so forth? That is, in a sense, the promise of liberalism. And what neo-progressivism comes along and says, is that really enough? Is it really enough to have that? What if I can manage to banish any slight, banish any suggestion that someone else in the world imagines that I am less than them, that someone in the world imagines that someone in the world is refusing to affirm my lifestyle and my choices and my blessedness and my holiness, that someone in the world refuses to see the God within me? What if I can banish the idea that if I can banish all of that? And so neo-progressivism takes liberalism and goes a certain step further. But now let's continue to listen to Vervaeke, because he's going to note that before scientific liberalism didn't banish all of this want on such a massive scale, we developed all of these technologies, and we can make some observations about the good in the midst of this. Because again, it's interesting that neither Zizek nor Peterson finally camp out on happiness, because somehow here in modernity, in modern liberalism, we are still haunted to imagine that even here in the midst of modern affluent American suburbia, that not all things are sufficient to satisfying us.
So what did the Stoics advocate that we need to do? Well, we need to bring this process of co-identification, of assuming various roles of our agency, assuming various identities, and assigning various identities in the arena. We need to bring this whole, co-determination, co-creation of agency and arena into our awareness. So they advocated prosos and prokairon. And you're going to see similarities here to what we saw in Buddhism, but also some differences. So prosos is to pay attention. Now, obviously, we're always paying attention, so that's useless advice. What they meant is pay attention to how you're paying attention. Pay attention to how you're judging. Pay attention to this process. Learn, right? Learn to see there's a difference between the meaning, and I mean here the modal meaning, the existential mode you're in. I don't mean semantic meaning. Learn to distinguish between the meaning and the event. Let's stop here. Let's stop here. This is the core, I would argue, of all of our current psychotherapies that are cognitive psychotherapies. Learning to distinguish between the event and the meaning you give the event.
The meaning you give the event. Now, this is where, if you go back to the Vervaeke-Peterson conversation, this is meaning given? Is meaning projected onto an event? Now, Vervaeke is exactly right. Learn to distinguish the event from the meaning, but the real question is going to be the trickiness of, is there actually a connection between the event and meaning that is independent of my projection? In other words, when I'm looking at meaning in an event, am I actually seeing something that is there? Now, we might this gets very tricky. This little tweet by Esther O'Reilly that, as usual for Esther, will lead to a huge conversation on Twitter, for which Twitter is not really that well equipped for, has this tweet. Well, if this doesn't get you out of bed in the morning, I don't know what will. She tweets from some Professor Alice Roberts. Humanist mini-sermon. You're not meant to be here. Your existence was not preordained. You're not part of some supernatural plan for the universe. Your very existence was unlikely, and so many chance events along the way. You're lucky to have this life. You can give it meaning. So that sets us then back into this question of, well, meaning. Do we put meaning in? Do we discover meaning? What is the relationship between meaning and the world outside of ourselves? And now we're looking at, with Vervaeke, we're looking at the question of the, let me make sure I get the right tab. I've got so many open here. We look at the relationship between the event and meaning, and Vervaeke rightly says these things get locked in together. And the heart of a lot of contemporary therapy is working people to an event, and they've taken event and meaning, and they've so locked it down that this is now causing trouble for their lives. And so slowly, bit by bit, the therapist helps them kind of pull back and say, well, you have this event, and maybe you took it to mean this, maybe your spouse or your child or your coworker took it to mean this. You're seeing it from 2 points of view, that this event can have multiple meanings. Okay? And that isn't hard to imagine because multiple people are seeing it. But that's a different thing from saying this event in itself has no meaning in itself, and any meaning that can be attached to it is as good as any other meaning. We don't want to say that. Everything simply becomes arbitrary or even relative from that. So this nexus between event and meaning is a vital one to think carefully about, and appreciate the fact that, yes, it's true that we get into real trouble when they get locked together like this, and we can't see the meaning of an event in any other way than what we've prescribed for it, or to say that there's just the event out there and any old meaning can be placed onto the event and it doesn't matter. Then suddenly you really are in a deep meaning crisis.
Because this is happening, this is like when I talked before about your glasses, they're normally transparent. Because we almost always unconsciously framing events, the meaning and the event are fused together. But here's the issue. They're not identical. Events are events. The meaning is the co-identification process that is taking place in response to the event. That could be a process of parasitic processing. that's not intrinsic to the event at all. In fact, the meaning isn't part of the event at all. And this is important, because if you keep them fused, you will be confused. If the meaning and the event are fused, the only way you can alter the meaning is by altering the event. The problem with that is sometimes you can, but here's the thing.
Now, right there, you have, in a sense, the project of liberalism, because, well, happiness is derived from our events and circumstances, and so what we look for is the power to mold these events as our wills demand, and then we will be happy. It doesn't work. Even when we have tremendous power, and again, you'll see that. If I would be happy if only I had more money, if only I had the kind of people around me that I desire, but usually those that mirror me. If only I had so on and so on. So the circumstances around me dictate my happiness, and happiness is the goal of modern liberalism. And the capacity to manage through power to deliver all the circumstances that we imagine will give us happiness, well, this is what we must not be alienated from in terms of Marxism, or denied by bigotry or chauvinism or racism or any of these other things that are what neo-progressivism demands. And so what we must do is take control in order to create this world which will in fact deliver to us the things that we assume will give us happiness.
Here's the thing that the Stoics are doing, and this is very much like what the Buddha was doing with trying to make you realize how threatened you are. You do not have as much control as you think you do. Epictetus, one of the great Stoic philosophers, starts his manual for living, basically his instruction manual of how to try and live a Stoic life, with saying, the core of wisdom is knowing what's in your control and what's not in your control. And stop pretending that things are in your control that aren't.
Ever hear about the Serenity Prayer? Neo-Orthodoxy?
Because most of the time, we do not exercise as much control over events as we like to believe, and we delude ourselves that we do, precisely because if we lose control of the event, we will, of course, lose control of the meaning, because we have fused the meaning and the event together. We are confused, existentially confused. How can such a confusion occur to us? We've already talked about this. I mentioned Erich Fromm when we talked about the being and the having mode. I mentioned at that time, and we would come back to it, that Fromm was directly influenced by the Stoics. It's the Stoics who got us, to realize, to use Frommian language, the distinction between the having mode and the being mode. The having mode is met by controlling things. And there are some things we literally have to control.
And this, of course, is the liberal project.
Water, food, air, shelter.
Things we can colonize and deliver on a mass scale. And this is a good thing.
But most of our most pertinent needs are not needs that are met by exercising control. They are needs that are met by enhancing meaning. We have to become.
And this is where liberalism breaks down, and this is the bonding of neo-progressivism with identity.
Look, the being mode is met by developing the agent-arena relationship, by becoming mature, which isn't just something that happens inside of me. Look, when I become mature, it isn't just that I'm changed inside. I also inhabit a different arena. And we recognize that socially. That's why we don't let little kids get married or drive cars or own guns. They're not allowed to move in a certain arena. Maturity is a agent-arena relationship. It is a particular existential meaning.
And you can see in this, there's actually a critique of liberalist eschatology in here, because you don't need to grow up if everything is satisfied. In fact, most of the time we grow up when we come up against obstacles that cannot be moved. And these are often other people. And now suddenly, then we begin to inhabit the agent arena, and we begin to use these kinds of tools to adjust our perspective on well-being.
But if you do not know how to separate the meaning from the events, you're liable to be very seriously modally confused, such that you pursue maturity by trying to have a car. You pursue being in love by having sex and controlling and manipulating. But it doesn't work, because you really can't exercise as much control over the world as you need in order to stabilize the meaning. Do you see how this is like the cynics still? Right? You're trying to control a world that largely is beyond your control. You're setting your hearts on things, and your heart's going to be broken. But it's not just about man-made things. Anything can fall prey to this. You have to practice bringing into your awareness in a way that is transformative and developmental the distinction between events and the meaning of events, and realizing this. You often act as if you have no control over the meaning because you're ignorant of the processes and it's transparent to you, and you focus on trying to control the event, in which you often have much less control than you realize. This is what you should do. Pull the two apart, the meaning and the event, and recalibrate your sense of control and identity, because you have actually way more control over this than you realize or practice, and you have way less control over this than you realize or practice.
Way more control over the meaning and the interpretation of the event than you have over the event itself. And again, in terms of what happens with the eschatology of liberalism, you bump into other people. And this is why other people are always the bane of this eschatology. And it's very interesting. In C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, you start in this gray city, and everyone can have anything they ever want just by thinking of it. And the one thing that becomes abundantly clear is the thing that you can't stand are other people. Hell is other people.
That's why the core of wisdom is knowing what's in our control versus what's not in our control. So, how do you practice that? And how does your identity change as you do? Well, the practice is prochiron. This means sort of ready to hand. It means remembering, but in the sense of sati, like mindfulness. It means remembering in a way that brings skills and sensitivities and sensibilities to bear in an appropriate and effective manner. It means remembering in a modally existential sense. So you practice a bunch of psychotechnologies to try and get them so internalized that you can not know that there's a distinction. I know that I should go outside the 9 dots, But I need to know how to actually separate these things. So, what do? Well, you engage in moment-to-moment practices. You can see this. A book where you can see somebody doing this. And the book has to be read properly because many people misread the book. This is the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. People read this book and they...
I'm going to pause here. Again, I'll have the link below. You can watch the whole video. I really like how he ends this video. Real cliffhanger about Christianity. Fun to listen to, but wanted to jump ahead over some of the Marcus Aurelius stuff, which is also good, but I'm just simply running out of time.
Most therapy is about getting people to see this. Perspectival change. Perspectival knowing. And then to identify with it. Change their sense of self, their sense of control, so that they move off trying to so much change the events that they can't control as much as they deeply, desperately want to cognitively reframing the meaning. And again, this isn't just semantic meaning. This is the identity, your participatory meaning, your existential mode. And this takes tremendous practice. The last thing you'll see Marcus Aurelius doing, and even more Epictetus, is the practice of actually internalizing Socrates, like Antisthenes talked about at the very beginning of this whole tradition.
So go ahead and watch the rest of it. I have to wrap this video up because I've got some conversations coming up. The eschatology of liberalism. We are naturally religious. We naturally desire happiness, and the assumptions behind liberalism can understand why they've simply conquered the world, as Scott Alexander noted, because it's so basic to how we are and how we operate that, well, if circumstances are bad, I'm unhappy, and so the most direct way to find happiness is to use whatever power I have to rearrange circumstances in order to yield the happiness within me. And so to the degree that we can scale up, and Brett Weinstein has a wonderful video on finding undiscovered countries to colonize and use, and to the degree that we can do that, this is success. And to the degree that we can kind of stay away from each other and do this in our own little realms, we call this happiness. And this is in many ways the eschatology of liberalism. But now in order to inhabit this world, we must situate ourselves with a creation myth, with an eschatological myth which pulls us into the future. We get propelled from the past, pulled us into the future from our eschatology, but that eschatological myth will calibrate our meaning compass. And this you find, and this then becomes a real problem in terms of secularism, because of the epistemological iron box of secularism via metaphysical skepticism. We no longer have a sextant to navigate by the stars, so we try to use dead reckoning. Okay, so here's the picture. Liberalism says, well, here we are. Well, I'm happy when I eat chocolate. I'm happy when I eat steak. I'm happy when I have a comfortable sofa and sex with a beautiful woman, and all of these things make happiness. And so what I need to do is use my power in order to gain all these things. Well, this won't actually lead to maturity. And so right away we have a difficulty of, well, what is the good? Well, chocolate feels good, and steak feels good, and sex feels good, and comfy sofas feel good, and air conditioning feels good, and new experience feels good. And so the definition of the good is that which delivers this to as many people, because when I have it and other people don't have it, they get upset with me, and that makes me nervous because they might take it from me. And so we have all of these dynamics. Okay. This then becomes the eschatology, and it pulls us into the future. But questions of bigger good and direction are much more difficult for us because we're tending to live right down here in the here and now. Over the weekend, I went down to San Diego and visited the the aircraft carrier there, and it was very interesting. The aircraft carrier, the Midway, had in the navigation room there a sextant, and they keep a sextant there just in case all of their systems fail and they need to navigate by the stars. And I thought, here's the problem of secularism. You can't see the stars. And so the stars our culture navigates by are the ones who live in Southern California, and are the ones who populate People magazine, and are the ones whose faces are in the stories that we use to navigate our world. And this is the world of liberalism. Now, in the Peterson-Zizek, you have the hopeful humanist versus the merry optimist. Can Jordan Peterson's liberal optimism, which is far less than Pinker and Harris's, hold back the moral enthusiasm? And when I use enthusiasm here, I'm thinking about Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening, this passionate religious enthusiasm that we see welling up in neo-progressivism, that is enlivening the mobs at Evergreen. And again, I think back about the person in my meetup who said, the table was set by Bret Weinstein, and the faculty and the students picked up the knives and, in a sense, exhibited their programming. But there were certain assumptions built into the older programmers that knew that now the young programmers, well, you're just trying to satisfy these. What if we dream bigger? What if we imagine there's no racism? Imagine all these implicit things which I feel, or at least I imagine I feel in others, or which I can sense. All of these little, even tiny implicit no's, these tiny barriers that are between me and the eschatology of liberalism. Imagine we can wipe them all away. Well, and then you go back to Damian Walters. Well, shouldn't we push through? Shouldn't we overcome those barriers? Shouldn't we? I mean, we killed Nazis in World War II. Shouldn't we punch them today? Evergreen not only set steak knives on the table, but also the heady wine of the utopia that we must usher in because of the iron box of secularism. And I've mentioned this in a variety of my videos. One of the things that secularism does is makes any promise that might wait for a future, the demand is that we have it now. Because, well, maybe my children can benefit from future generations, but I'm not even going to have children, because I was just listening to the Akira the Don Jordan Peterson podcast today where they talked about childlessness. I'm not going to have children. Nothing of me is going to benefit future populations. I need my best life now. And so anyone who stands in the way of that, I've only got 80 years to live. I've got to get rid of these obstacles now. And so there's this intensification that happens, and this demand, because there's no heaven to wait for, no axial age, better world up above. I've got to remove every barrier now, and we need to bring heaven down to earth, which, as I've mentioned before, usually brings hell up with it. So it is up to us to save ourselves. Now, it was always up to us to save ourselves in liberalism, and we can determine our future. But the foreshortened horizon of secularism means it all must happen now, or you won't taste it. That's the eschatology. How far back must we deconstruct? Is this liberalism's terminal state? Is the neo-progressivism that Zizek and Peterson now look in horror upon? Is this liberalism's terminal state? Is this where it goes? Evergreen might suggest that. Marx is just as much a child of the Western Enlightenment as is Adam Smith, remember. Also a part of this large stream coming out of Christendom. Progressivist dreams and violent enthusiasms are raised at the table set by liberalism. So where do we go back? Where do we go from here? So I am out of time, and that's probably enough for this video. I hope I've set the table well and introduced you to some new interesting thinkers and talkers and given you some new ideas. And let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks a lot.